bych rád představil Roba Jacksona, který je absolventem King's College v Londýně a zabývá se jedním důležitým tématem, jimž je možný vztah mezi dílem Alaina Badioua a dílem západního marxismu, jako je například dílo Georga Lukáče, nebo je to dílo Antonia Gramsciho. Nyní bude hovořit o Alainu Badiouovi a Georgi Lukáčovi.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and also I want to say thank you again to both Michael and Jana and everyone involved in organising and the conference, because I think it's a fantastic opportunity, certainly for me, but obviously for many people involved, and also thank you to the translators who've been doing fantastic work. So in this paper, I want to really present the beginnings of a project to explore a hypothesis that a reading of Alain Badiou's conception of political subjectivity can be taken against that of the Hungarian Marxist philosopher Georg Lukács, and that reading these two thinkers together can lead to reciprocally stimulating insights for the comprehension of the work of both thinkers. In particular, I want to argue that the comparison of Lukács with Badiou aids a project of reading Lukács, to employ Walter Benjamin's phrase, against the grain of history. And in light of the new ways that the problem of subjectivity has been addressed in recent years by Badiou and others, I believe it's now possible to begin to reassess the resources that Lukács provides us with on this question. So I should point out from the outset that I'm neither proposing or assuming a perfect correlation between the thought of these two thinkers, nor even necessarily a compatibility between them. Badiou and Lukács plainly deploy very heterogeneous conceptual frameworks. Their bodies of work arise from two very different intellectual and historical conjunctures. Badiou from the array of influences that was laid out very well by Giuseppe Bianco yesterday, and particularly from the left radical milieu of 1960s France, and Lukács, on the other hand, primarily from the Hungarian and German intellectual scenes at the turn of the 20th century and after. So Badiou and Lukács therefore draw on two very distinct, although not mutually exclusive, sets of intellectual influences, not to mention the different contexts of their respective formative political engagements. For Lukács, that would entail what Badiou calls the event of 1917, and shortly afterwards, his experience actively involved in the Hungarian Republic of 1919, and the wave of revolutionary struggles in Europe during the 1920s. And for Badiou, the event of 1968 and its aftermath. It might seem, therefore, that Lukács is something of a strange intellectual sparring partner for Badiou, not least since Lukács has been described by Slavoj Žižek as the Hegelian antipode of one of Badiou's key early influences, Louis Althusser. In addition to this, while Lukács has been represented in particular ways in the French intellectual scene through the thought of Lucien Goldman and others, Lukács has never really been a figure of primary importance in France, someone to whom it was necessary to make reference. Despite or even because of this, however, my gambit is that laying some of the conceptual tools from Lukács alongside those of Badiou may help to present us with new vantage points or new strategies from which to survey the conceptual apparatus of each. I should also mention at this point that I'm not a scholar of Badiou's thought. I have, however, orientated my doctoral thesis, a study of the problem of subjectivity in Marx, Georg Lukács, and the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci, towards gathering resources to address the problem of subjectivity as it has been formulated by more contemporary philosophers such as Badiou and Žižek. I'm therefore very keen to hear the thoughts and comments of those with a much greater experience of Badiou's oeuvre than myself. As a preliminary, I also need to clarify to which of the works by Lukács I'll be referring. I will not be discussing his early writings on literature, such as Soul and Forms from 1911 or Theory of the Novel from 1916. However, I'm not proposing a total disjunction between Lukács's political and his aesthetic concerns. As the US theorist Frederick Jameson has rightly pointed out, all of Lukács's works are shot through with aesthetic reflections, and his central concern with the aspiration, or in the German has more the implication of intention towards totality, is tightly interwoven with his conception of narrative. Equally, I will not be dealing with Lukács's later writings from the end of the 1920s onwards that are often seen to be coloured by his ambiguous accommodation with the Stalinist reality of the USSR, notwithstanding, of course, his later support for and formal involvement with the 1956 Hungarian uprising, and towards the very end of his life, his expression of enthusiasm for the events of 1968. I would propose that since both Lukács and Badiou are associated with a commitment to the theorization of a radical type of subjectivity, the works of Lukács most pertinent to this comparison are those drawn from Lukács's period of committed revolutionary activity, from his return to Hungary in 1918 until the mid-1920s and the rise of the Stalinist Thermidor. During this period, Lukács produced a number of texts, including those gathered in the collection Tactics and Ethics from 1919 and his tribute to Lenin, subtitled A Study in the Unity of His Thought from 1924. His seminal contribution, however, or contributions, are to be found in his collection of essays known as History and Class Consciousness from 1923, published in 1923, written over a period, and in his recently rediscovered defense of that work from several years later, published as Taylorism and the Dialectic, which is thought to have been written in 25-26. And it's these works that I'll primarily refer to today. In a manner quite suggestive of the connections that I'm trying to evoke, Žižek has referred to History and Class Consciousness as one of the few authentic events in the history of Marxism. It was this text, Žižek argues, that produced a traumatic impact on generations of Marxists to come, and was indeed later rejected by Lukács himself. It should therefore be pointed out that Žižek's reading of Lukács also runs against the grain, as it were, of conventional academic opinion. When Lukács is referenced in academia today, and he is indeed most frequently invoked for his theories of literature, his writings on politics and political subjectivity are usually quite summarily critiqued, even by those quite strongly influenced by his theory of reification, for the seemingly dogmatic character of Lukács's political commitment to the proletariat. In particular, the Frankfurt School tradition has always maintained an uneasy distance from Lukács's concept of the proletariat as the identical subject-object of history, as the working class in its aspect of philosophical, world-historical effectivity. A rare exception to this conventional wisdom is that of Frederick Jameson. In his Valences of the Dialectic, Jameson adopts a different approach to Lukács's conception of political subjectivity in history and class consciousness. Jameson encourages us to see the concept of the identical subject-object within Lukács's work as, quote, the local thematic climax of Lukács's intermittent engagement throughout this text with the central motifs of German idealism from Fichte to Hegel. For Jameson, it is preferable, indeed necessary today, to retranslate, quote, the perspectival and subject-oriented figure of the standpoint into the structural notion of the positioning of a given class or class fraction in the social totality. Despite the difficulties that may be associated with Lukács's class-based account of social mediation, Jameson enjoys us to locate the contemporary form of this figure. He therefore encourages us to see Lukács's history and class consciousness as an unfinished project, as the beginning of a work yet to be done. Or to translate this into more Badiousian terms, Jameson is encouraging us to retain a fidelity to what Zizek calls the Lukácsian event. The dominant reception of history and class consciousness tends to assimilate Lukács's position to a substitution of the proletariat for a crude characterization of the Hegelian absolute, despite Lukács's explicit critique of this in the main essay on reification in history and class consciousness. A counter-reading, however, could take this essay not as a linear progression through bourgeois philosophy culminating in the mechanical triumph of this quasi-Hegelian supersubject of the proletariat, but as an altogether more non-linear and ongoing engagement with various procedures of de-reification. In this respect, Lukács's comments about the multiple routes towards de-reification are important. And with Oliver Feltham's paper from yesterday in mind, Lukács's comments about the de-reifying capacities of Shakespeare are particularly illuminating. Jameson's reading of Lukács aims to displace any ascription of a mechanical conception of synthesis to Lukács, but rather to restore the unpredictability of the dialectic being represented by Lukács, and what Jameson calls the unsuspected dimensions of the problem, interrelationship and process. On one level, Lukács's rejection of the notion of the Hegelian absolute is clear. For Lukács, the absolute is nothing but the fixation of thought. Quote, it is the projection into myth of the intellectual failure to understand reality concretely as a historical process. Yet accusations of absolutism continue to dog his attempts to render philosophically the idea of the proletariat somehow as a universal class. In his postface to Lukács's Taylorism and the Dialectic, Zizek examines the dialectical logic of this affirmation. Zizek argues that the claim that the proletariat is the universal class is equivalent to claiming that it is radically dislocated with relation to the social body. In this perspective, Lukács's notion of the proletariat assumes the aspect of radical dislocation that appears to speak much more productively to the Badiousian framework. Given that Badiou is a very perceptive reader of Hegel, I think if we wish to make any fruitful comparison between Badiou and Lukács, I would suggest that it's certainly this reading of Lukács against the grain in the manner of Jameson or Zizek that we need to take up. This perspective of dislocation, however, has been critiqued by the UK-based Marxist Alex Kalinikos. In his Resources of Critique, Kalinikos claims that this conception risks scrambling beyond recognition the coordinates of what he calls the class map of modern society. Yet given the challenges facing the renewal of radical politics today, this may, however, be a risk that it's necessary for committed intellectuals to take. So after this long introduction, we can now perhaps begin to initiate more of a comparison between Badiou and Lukács. And at the most general level, one could say that they're both philosophers of the dialectic. So it's clear for both thinkers that an understanding of change and transformation is of vital importance to their work. Indeed, both of their bodies of work seek to address the theme of the possibility of radical change, either through a fidelity to the possibility of universal truths, or through a philosophical commitment to the proletariat in overthrowing the entangled web of reification that is generated by capitalist society. It's therefore possible to examine the potential affinities between Badiou's conception of change as a rupture from the normal routines of material existence, crudely put, and Lukács's rejection of conventional notions of historical progress. The main point that I want to suggest today is that certain perhaps prefigurative moments of Badiou's formulation of the event can be observed in Lukács's writings from this period. Indeed, as Žižek has noted, one such antecedent is Lukács's conception of Augenblick. This concept accounts for the art of seizing the correct moment for an act to intervene within a situation. I would argue that this concept shares some important characteristics with a cornerstone of Badiou's theoretical framework, his elaboration of the gap between being and event. So let's take Lukács's definition of Augenblick from his Taylorism, the Dialectic. So after posing the question, what is an Augenblick? Lukács responds, a situation whose duration may be longer or shorter, but which is distinguished from the process that leads up to it, in that it forces together the essential tendencies of that process, and demands that a decision be taken over the future direction of the process. That is to say that the tendencies reach a sort of zenith, and depending on how the situation concerned is handled, the process takes on a different direction after the moment, after the Augenblick. Here, Lukács's concept of Augenblick appears to share some fundamental features with Badiou's notion of the event, an intervention that cannot be accounted for in terms of its pre-existing objective conditions. It's possible, therefore, that the zenith referred to in Lukács's situation could be characterized as corresponding somehow to an eventual opening. And this is where an interesting discussion between perspectives could perhaps arise about the nature of this intervention in the situation. Historically, there have been many debates about the possibility of a premature intervention, what constitutes this prematurity, and in what ways it could also be seen perhaps as forcing a situation, or rather making an intervention that in itself is a sort of reshuffling of the global matrix. So I would like to appeal on this, as I say, as a work in process, to the kind of Badiousian palette for resources in addressing this question. And I'm very sorry, really, that we won't be hearing Frank Ruder's discussion about the notion of preparedness for the event, because I think there are many related questions to other papers in this topic. Perhaps also of interest is Lukács's emphasis in this respect to the notion of process, which Michael Hauser raised yesterday in his criticisms of Badiou, and perhaps whether we can turn to Lukács for resources about thinking through a theory of process. But here it's perhaps useful to invoke once more the figure of Walter Benjamin. In common with Lukács, Benjamin's theory of revolution, expressed in his Theses on the Philosophy of History, is one that counters the deterministic notion of progress associated primarily with the dominant Marxism of the Second International. The continuities between the concerns of Lukács and Badiou can perhaps be illuminated by Benjamin's vivid approach to these themes. Benjamin sought to unify messianic and revolutionary thought by conceptualizing revolution as the blowing open of the continuum of what he called homogeneous empty time, an oblivion filled with data into which the oppressed past disappears. Badiou's affirmation that miracles happen is perhaps reminiscent of Benjamin's notion of the sudden emergence of now time, in which history becomes available to humanity. Benjamin draws a link between the possibility of such a tiger's leap into the past and the possibility of revolutionary change. Although perhaps here the historical direction, the facing of the angel of history backwards and future-orientated theories perhaps needs to be taken into account. But nevertheless, perhaps we can start to look for connections, mutual points of clarification between Lukács and Badiou in this conception of a leap, which is also a necessary one for Lukács, involved in the overcoming of reification and the eruption of the new that we associate with the fidelity of Badiou's subject to the event. To assess this, I think it's necessary and perhaps beyond the scope of this paper to investigate the relationship of each thinker to temporality. For Badiou's notion of the faithful subject, a particular truth is sustained through time. But how are we to react to criticisms that are advanced against these radical thinkers, that they somehow render violence towards conceptions of normal time or normality, time in normal periods? Indeed, in History and Class Consciousness, Lukács argues that the possibility of a sudden dislocation in a moment of crisis is crucial to the possibility of a revolutionary subjectivity. Other thinkers of Lukács' time, such as Antonio Gramsci, also strive to describe the possibility, during an organic crisis, of the masses reorganizing themselves like lightning in comparison with periods of calm. Lukács has been often criticized for seeking to give a theoretical basis to the capacity of the proletariat to advance its political consciousness by leaps. This leap between an empirical or sociological consciousness of the working class and the imputed or ascribed consciousness of the proletariat has been identified in Lukács as messianic. Although perhaps a more generous reading of Lukács attempts to diffuse these criticisms through an understanding of the generation of social mediations that he seeks to propose. Although I think, nevertheless, great difficulties remain in his thought on this point. Because while Lukács recognizes gradations in class consciousness, there is a certain absence of content to his analysis of these intermediate stages. This is in contrast, perhaps, to someone like Gramsci, for whom the concrete forms of institutionalization associated with the development of a hegemonic project tend to mitigate against the speculative excesses of Lukács. My proposal is, therefore, that there is a potential, perhaps, to translate what Lukács calls the problem of genesis and compare it with Badiou's understanding of how genuine novelty enters the world. Badiou's interventions are not an intellectual exercise, as he points out, but a fidelity to events like May 68 that consists, as he says, in organizations, in the taking up of positions, and in an activism that conserves the memory of things. So whilst acknowledging the great difference between Badiousian and Lukácsian frameworks, this commitment denotes a productive starting point for their comparison. Famously, Lukács attempts to mediate between his philosophical and empirical notions of the working class by addressing the organizational problems of a revolutionary party in the later essays of History and Class Consciousness. But it is necessary, of course, to break down, or at least to reinterpret, the Lukácsian concept today of the revolutionary party as some kind of meutic catalyst for the proletariat as subject. But how to do this? Could we perhaps rethink Lukács's conception of the party form of organization somehow as an engagement with the Badiousian problem of transmission? Might this be an organizational form that generalizes the capacity to seize on the interruption, and in Badiou's sense then some kind of active producer in the production of truth? Or is Lukács's discussion of organization as a crucible for preserving class memory more fitting to the model of Agamben's witness that we discussed during the day yesterday? Or is perhaps Lukács somehow offering us resources to bridge between these two visions? So while Lukács's theory of the relationship between the revolutionary party and the proletariat tends to exhibit a certain emphasis on matters of form rather than content, this contentless aspect could lead us to consider to what extent there's a certain void-like quality to his conception of revolutionary organization. Now, there are, of course, many obstacles to the theoretical comparisons that I'm very schematically making between Badiou and Lukács. I've deliberately focused my efforts on the productive potentials of this project. However, it would obviously be remiss not to address the difficulties as well. And I'll mention several, but it's clear that we could find many more. I mentioned before the relative non-discussion of Lukács in the French intellectual tradition, although obviously he has been dealt with by many of the many thinkers in France. Jean-Paul Sartre perhaps expresses most starkly one of the major differences in tradition quite succinctly in his Rome lecture from 1961, which has recently been republished in under the title of Qu'est-ce que la subjectivité, where the Lukácsian concern with subject and object is displaced in favor of the terrain of subjectivity and subjectivation. Although whether we want to accept that formal distinction is perhaps of importance as in terms of whether we want to reject or continue along this project. And despite our reconception of Lukács's notion of the proletariat as dislocation, it remains the fact that becoming a class subject for Lukács involves a transparent acquisition of class consciousness that is very distant from the Badiousian framework, in which the subject is of a much more complex, uncertain, and decentered nature. And so Lukács's attempt to reformulate Marxism as a philosophy of praxis must also be examined. To what extent, perhaps, and I appeal to the audience for this, would Lukács's position be regarded somehow as a suturing of philosophy to the political condition, in contrast to Badiou's conception of a philosophy which lies at the elusive intersection of different truth procedures? And is it not the case, perhaps, that a social ontology like Lukács's is somehow essentially generative through its Hegelian inheritance. Should we therefore contrast this with Badiou's subtractive maneuver as a sort of polarization between generation and subtraction? Another feature which distinguishes Badiou from both from Lukács is Badiou's insistence on the rarity or the elusive nature of the subject. By contrast, Lukács attempts to use his theory of reification to demonstrate that the structure of a crisis is not qualitatively different to that of the daily life of bourgeois society, but rather simply the peak of its intensity. It seems that Lukács almost subverts normality to be a constant state of exception. And here we can think of Marx's observation in the first volume of Capital that somehow the potential for crisis lurks in the most indeterminate form of commodity exchange, in the separation of purchases and sales. Furthermore, perhaps Lukács's definition of theory as aiming to, quote, destroy the fiction of the immortality of the categories radically opposes him to Badiou's definition of subjectivity as the fidelity to the invariance of the idea. And this hostility to transhistoricity is characteristic of much of the tradition that's been inspired by Lukács's thought in critical theory, one of the most recent examples being Moïse Postone's attempt to re-engage with Marx's Grundrisse in his Time, Labour and Social Domination. And indeed, in reference to my earlier comments about time, Postone develops the concept of abstract time in this work that could be relevant, I think, to our discussions. So in conclusion, really, I have further questions. Can a Badiousian reading of Lukács help to uncover those questions which are excluded from the conventional interpretation of Lukács, or excluded from the horizon of Lukács's thought more generally? Can it help to actualize Lukács's legacy in a meaningful way for contemporary debates on the problem of subjectivity? Or are the problems that I've begun to outline of reconciliation somehow insurmountable? Does the appeal to Lukács place us in the position, as I asked, of suturing philosophy to the political condition? Perhaps, as Zizek has suggested, the path to discovering a defensible account of subjectivity amongst these figures leads through a reference to the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci. Certainly there's a distinct Gramscian flavour to Badiou's recent emphasis on the notion of immanence and the category of life in his lectures. Not to mention our discussions yesterday, which reminded me of Gramsci's famous dictum that everyone is a philosopher. Famously, Gramsci's theory of hegemony investigates the capacities of developed capitalist societies to avert crises through the elaboration of the stabilizing institutional apparatuses of civil society. Less explored, perhaps, is the full significance of Gramsci's in-depth study of the negative pole of the hegemonic subaltern axis in his thought, his central relationship. In Anglophone scholarship in particular, we've employed only a fragment of Gramsci's writings on subalternity up until now. We might also suggest that a route beyond this impasse requires a return to the resources offered by another thinker of significance for Badiou, Jean-Paul Sartre. Indeed, the question that Badiou posed last night in relation to his forthcoming volume on the immanence of truth, how do individuals appear from the point of view of truth, is one that seems really impossible to answer from the Lukácsian standpoint, for whom, in one of these quite apparently dogmatic statements, Lukács declares there is no path from the individual to the totality. But Badiou's question could well be rephrased in the terms that Sartre deployed in his final work, the biography of Flaubert, L'idiot de la famille, when he asks at the very beginning, what can be said of a man today? With Badiou adding, from the perspective of truth. From this perspective, a Badiousian reading can enrich Lukács by drawing on the Sartrean elements identified by Oliver yesterday, derived from the laboratory of Sartre's theatre, but also in the very different model of subjectivation developed through Sartre's Saint-Genet, his critique of dialectical reason, and L'idiot de la famille. So there are many other aspects of a comparison between Badiou and Lukács that we could examine, such as their shared concern for ethics, or the possible relation between the Pascalian wager and Lukács's wager on communism. However, at this point, I think I'll cease my speculations in order to better take in the comments, criticisms, and responses that you may have. Thank you very much.